quiet neighbor. A mystery that shouldn't have been solved. Moving always causes mixed feelings, the joy of a new beginning, nervousness due to the unknown, and a slight longing for the old places. James knew that better than anyone. After the divorce and quitting his job, he wanted to start with a clean slate, and a small apartment complex in the suburbs seemed like the perfect place. Cozy, quiet, with friendly neighbors, everything you need for a new life. Apartment 3B, which he moved into, was perfectly furnished and tidy. The neighbors seemed friendly at first. Mrs. Fletcher, an elderly lady who lives opposite, often greeted and offered help. A married couple with a child from 2A smiled as they passed by. But there was one oddity that James noticed right away. Apartment 3C next to his seemed different. Her door always remained closed, and no noise or signs of life came from there. When he asked Mrs. Fletcher about it, she just smiled mysteriously. "He rarely goes out. A very calm person. I think you're lucky that the neighbor is so quiet." James did not attach any importance to this. On the first evening, he unpacked boxes, enjoyed the new surroundings, and listened to music. But when he was about to go to bed, a strange sound made him freeze. It was a faint, rhythmic thud, like someone was typing on an old typewriter. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. Probably the neighbors from below or above, James thought, and closed his eyes. The next day, James decided to find out more about his neighbors. As he passed apartment 3C, he thought he heard a faint rustling inside, as if someone was slowly turning the pages of a book. James stopped and knocked, but no one answered. In the evening, he heard that rhythmic knocking again, but this time the sound was louder, clearer. It seemed like it was coming straight from 3C. He went to the wall, put his ear to it, but at that moment everything stopped. On the third day, James went to throw out the trash and met Mrs. Fletcher. "Tell me, do you know the tenant from 3C?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She looked at him with a strange look. "Mr. Ellis? He has been living here for a long time. A very quiet man, but yes, maybe too quiet." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Fletcher hesitated. "You know, I've been living here for 20 years, and in all that time I've never seen him invite anyone to visit or go outside during the day. But he's always at home. Always." Her words left James confused. "And also," she added, looking around as if she was afraid someone would overhear, "sometimes at night it seems that there is a sound coming from his apartment. Laughter. Quiet, but strange. It's like he's laughing at someone, not something." James felt a chill run down his spine. James couldn't get Mrs. Fletcher's words out of his head. Laughter, knocking, and the fact that this man never left the apartment. It all seemed like little things that formed an alarming picture. On the third night, James heard the knocking again. Now it was even louder and more rhythmic, as if someone had deliberately increased the tempo. It was infuriating. Suddenly the knocking stopped, but it was followed by a new sound, a soft, barely audible whisper. James walked over to the wall separating his apartment and 3C. He stopped, trying not to breathe, and listened. Nothing at first, but then the voices. Faint, barely audible, as if several people were talking at the same time, interrupting each other. His heart began to beat faster. He stepped back from the wall, but the sound didn't stop. Now the whisper became a little louder, and the words became distinguishable in it. "Can you hear us? Why are you listening?" James abruptly stepped back, almost tripping over the box. The voices stopped as suddenly as they had appeared. The next day, James decided to find out more about Mr. Ellis. He couldn't just ignore the oddities. After going to a local cafe, he got into conversation with a waitress, a young girl named Kim, who had been working in the area for several years. "Ellis, does he live in your complex?" "Yes, I've heard of him, although I don't know him personally. His name was mentioned several times by local residents. But you know what? They're talking about him." Kim looked around as if checking to see if anyone was eavesdropping. The people who lived in that house said that after meeting him, they felt better. Bad. Someone began to have dreams in which he appeared. Someone heard his voice, although he did not even open his mouth. You know, it's like he knows what's going on in your head. James felt a chill inside him. "What nonsense," he muttered, although he was no longer sure of it himself. The next night, James decided that he had to see Ellis in person. He couldn't stand the suspense any longer. Around midnight, he came to the door of 3C. Pausing for a moment, he knocked. Silence at first. Then, the sound of footsteps slowly approaching. The door opened. Standing in front of James was a tall man in his 50s. His face was pale, and his eyes were deep, as if bottomless. "How can I help you?" said Ellis in a voice that sounded even but too low for such a calm conversation. "I'm sorry to bother you," James began, trying to look confident, although he was nervous inside. "I'm your neighbor from 3B. Ellis looked at him for a few seconds, which seemed like an eternity. "To get acquainted?" he asked, slightly tilting his head. "Why?" James was confused. "Well, it's simple. To know who lives nearby." Ellis smiled. The smile was too even, unnatural. "Now you know. Good night." And with that, he closed the door. After meeting Mr. Ellis, James felt strangely uneasy. His cold smile, his manner of speaking, and his gaze as if studying, left an unpleasant aftertaste on my soul. The next day, James decided not to think about it and to distract himself. He had planned a trip to the store, but on the way out he heard the familiar knock from apartment 3C again. Only now the knocking was not so rhythmic. It sounded chaotic, as if someone was hitting a wall. He paused at his door, listening. The knocking suddenly stopped, but now it was replaced by a sound that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was a scratching sound, like claws scraping on a wooden floor. James hurried away, but turned around just before leaving. He looked at Dr. 3C, and for a moment it seemed to him that someone was looking at him from the peephole. James couldn't sleep that night. The words of Mrs. Fletcher and waitress Kim came back to his mind. Why was everyone talking about Ellis's weirdness? And what are those sounds in his apartment? At 3 o'clock in the morning, he was awakened by a sound that could not be confused with anything. Whisper. James. He sat up abruptly in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper sounded again, but closer now, as if someone was talking through the wall. He turned on the light, picked up the phone, and walked over to the wall. "Who's here?" he whispered, trying not to wake the neighbors. The answer was laughter, quiet, barely audible, but still terrifyingly ominous. The next morning, James met Mrs. Fletcher again at the entrance. This time, she looked worried. "Mr. Ellis is missing," she said softly. "Missing? How is that?" "I knocked on his door. I wanted to give him the mail. No one opened it. And you know what's weird? His apartment. She was dark. It's like no one's ever been there." James froze. He had seen Ellis quite recently, but now that he thought about it, it looked like his apartment was really empty. Maybe he's gone? James tried to guess, but Mrs. Fletcher just shook her head. "He's not leaving. Never." That night, James heard the knocking again, but now it sounded outside his door. He came over, slowly turning the handle. There was no one on the threshold, only the darkness of the corridor. And suddenly he heard a quiet whisper from his apartment. "Now I'm here." James froze, unable to believe his ears. The voice sounded from the depths of the apartment, although he knew for sure that he was alone. His hand on the door handle was shaking, and he slowly closed the door, trying not to make any noise. "Who's there?" His voice broke into a whisper, but there was only silence. James turned on the light in the hallway. Suddenly, it seemed to him that the light became dimmer, as if the bulb was losing power. When he entered the living room, he immediately noticed something strange. There was a piece of paper on the floor in the middle of the room. James knew he hadn't left him there. He slowly walked over and picked up the sheet. There were words written on it, in crooked letters, as if they had been written by a child's hand. "Do you hear us?" The knocking started again, now from all the walls. James felt fear take hold of him. He wanted to run out of the apartment, but when he got to the door, he realized that it wouldn't open. In a panic, he started calling the police, but the signal was gone. Instead of the beeps, he heard the same whisper. "They won't help." James dropped the phone and grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, to somehow protect himself. The whispers grew louder until they became clear voices. They sounded mocking. "We're with you, always." He rushed to the window, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. A sound filled the living room, either footsteps or something scratching the floor. James turned around and saw a shadow pass by him, leaving an icy trail behind it. The knocking suddenly stopped. There was a dead silence. James felt the room grow colder. "Ellis," he whispered, hoping it was his strange neighbor. But the answer was booming laughter filling the apartment. The laughter was reminiscent of the one Mrs. Fletcher had mentioned, quiet, mocking, but as if coming from a void. "You took his place," a voice sounded very close. James whirled around, but there was no one there. And then he saw a mirror on the wall. Ellis stood in his reflection, his empty eyes staring straight at James. At that moment, the lights in the apartment went out, leaving him in absolute darkness. A few days later, Mrs. Fletcher told the neighbors that James had disappeared. His apartment was empty. There was not a single thing inside, as if he had never lived there. "It looks like he left just like Mr. Ellis," she whispered to a neighbor. Apartment 3B was put up for sale, and soon a new tenant moved in. But from behind the wall, on the very first night, he heard a quiet whisper. The mystery of Apartment 3C. Trying to figure out what happened to Mr. Ellis and James, the neighbors discussed the strangeness of this apartment for a long time. People said different things, but no one knew the truth. However, if you carefully consider all the details, you can put together a terrifying picture. Apartment 3C was not an ordinary place. Perhaps this is not just a dwelling, but a kind of trap that feeds on the emotions and fears of those who dare to approach it. Mr. Ellis, apparently, had been her prisoner for many years, barely keeping in touch with reality. He did not come out into the light because the apartment seemed to hold him captive. When James moved in, he became a new victim. Whispers, knocks, distorted voices, all this was part of the apartment's game to break his will. Perhaps the apartment is looking for people who are unaware of its true nature, dragging them deeper and deeper until they disappear. Ellis could have disappeared because the cycle ended and the apartment chose a new owner. And James became her next prisoner, disappearing into her dark void, like everyone who had been in this place before him. Now the apartment is free again, ready for the next victim. New residents will never know what awaits them outside the door with the number 3B, and the neighbors, who are already used to oddities, will simply shrug their shoulders when the first whisper comes from behind the wall again. Their disappearance left more questions than answers, and the neighbors could only guess at the reasons. Mr. Ellis was not just a quiet and strange neighbor. He was probably the link between our world and some otherworldly entity or dimension. His apartment, 3C, served as a portal or habitat for this force. Whispers, knocks, strange sounds, and visions were manifestations of this entity, which either used Ellis as a guide or completely possessed him. When James moved into the apartment next door, he unwittingly attracted the attention of this force. His curiosity, attempts to learn more about Mr. Ellis, and interactions with him made him vulnerable. The whispers he heard and the visions were the first signs that the entity was beginning to influence him. Ellis's disappearance could have been the result of the entity completely absorbing him, or he became part of her world. When James became the next victim, history repeated itself. His apartment was empty, as if he had never lived there. Thus, apartment 3C, and possibly the entire residential complex, is a place where the boundaries between our world and the other are thinning. Those who get too close to solving this mystery or show excessive curiosity risk disappearing without a trace, becoming part of this otherworldly force. The cycle continues, and the next victim is already on his way to the mysterious apartment, unaware of its dark secret.